This week on the Capitol Report, plans are in the works for a state budget vote next week. The mayor of Hartford warns a bankruptcy filing is pending. And Governor Malloy urges residents to be prepared as the hurricane season heats up. Now, the Week in Review on the Capitol Report.
We intend to have a budget vote in both chambers next week.
Setting the stage for House and Senate action on a biennial budget, possibly next week, legislative leaders admitted on Tuesday a bipartisan agreement was still uncertain.
I don't know that we've ever said that we're close to a bipartisan deal. I said for the last few weeks, and Marty has agreed, that it's worth trying. In the end, I don't know if the differences are too large to overcome.
If there's any deal to be made on the numbers, there first has to be a consensus on the structural change. If you don't have consensus on the structural change, neither one of us are going to relent any numbers that are on the table.
Operating without a state budget now for 10 weeks, Governor Malloy has been left with the job of running state government by executive order. Democratic leaders in the House and Senate have targeted next week for possible budget votes in the House and Senate to prevent the governor's revised spending plan from going into effect on October 1st. It includes massive municipal funding cuts, including the complete elimination of school funding in 85 districts. At this point, there are separate budget proposals being worked on by Governor Malloy, House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and jointly by House and Senate Republicans. The original projection of a $5 billion deficit over 2 years has been modified with the now ratified state employee union concessions deal worth $1.5 billion. The hole left to fill, $3.5 billion, has all parties at odds. And adding to the difficulty of passing a budget, the narrow Democratic majority in the House and even split of Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. Bipartisan budget talks between legislative leaders continued this week, but progress appeared unclear.
Well, we're continuing to move down the road of figuring out what our commonalities are and if there's enough to move forward together. It's just a long process.
Well, we shared some additional information today and then agreed to meet again on Thursday. We did talk today some more about systemic reforms or structural changes. And also, we did hear from the Republicans that they have some more tweaks to their own budget proposal before they can give us some specifics on exactly how they fill in the gap between what their original proposal was on saving some state employees as opposed to what CBAC brings in. That remains a significant unanswered question that we have on their plan.
I think we believe that getting to the numbers will be a discussion that has to come after structural change. Without structural change, there's no sense talking about numbers.
Marty and I need somebody to negotiate with. If it's the governor's office or it's the Senate and House Republicans, we can't just do it with the votes that we have in our chamber. Ultimately, if it doesn't receive a governor's signature, we need 101 in the House and 24 plus in the Senate. And that's the reality we have, and we're working towards an area that maybe we can find that. If not, we all are very clear on what the governor's priorities are for the upcoming budget. And if the Republican members of the House and Senate decide not to work towards a bipartisan deal, some of the responsibility of what happens on October 1st is owned by them too.
The Speaker's sentiment was reinforced on Wednesday after he caucused with fellow House Democrats.
Our caucus asked us to spend the next 8 days working as hard as we can to ensure October 1st doesn't happen when what we believe is totally cataclysmically largest, worst possible case. I can't stress it enough that we just can't let October 1st happen to where public education in the state of Connecticut and the students that rely on it suffer the way that they may. So they asked us to spend the next 8 days up here again, sitting at the table with anybody that's willing to come to the table to negotiate a budget that we will vote on next Thursday. So our intention is to come in next Thursday and vote on a budget.
And I think our caucus feels the governor is moving, so I think they're moving a little bit. We're not yet dancing, but we're probably in the same ballroom.
The next day, Democratic leaders in the House and Senate were still talking with House and Senate Republicans.
We're going to continue to work. There was many ideas on structural change talked about over the last few meetings, and we're still working to find consensus in some areas. It's a little more difficult than I think we first imagined.
Right. We had a list of items that that the Republicans had put forward, some that we had put forward. We gave them a detailed response today to their list, to which they then requested more time to come back with a response to that. And they said they wanted to try to make a more detailed case for some of the items that we had not agreed to. So we're supposed to get that from them by, what, the end of the day tomorrow or Monday morning?
End of the day tomorrow. We'll get back together on Monday.
In the meantime, the Democratic leaders are open to reaching a budget agreement with the governor also.
We said very honestly to both Len and Themis that we are going in two tracks. Obviously, we're wondering if this could be a fruitful discussion, but we intend to, over the weekend, continue to talk to the Senate and the governor to see if we can reach agreement amongst ourselves.
Also on Thursday, Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin stepped up the pressure for a budget with a letter to the governor and legislative leaders, warning that the city of Hartford will be unable to meet its financial obligations in approximately 60 days. And if there is no budget or additional state funding in place at that time, we anticipate seeking authority to file Chapter 9 bankruptcy.
From a cash flow perspective, they're about 60 days away from being unable to pay their bills, and then you have to write the governor a letter, and we need to avoid that. I've said very clearly that I think it would be an embarrassment for the state of Connecticut to let any municipality go bankrupt, whether it's Scotland or Hartford. The challenges are not insurmountable. We just need to have a budget, and we're working very, very hard to do that. And the Hartford delegation's been up here every day this whole summer, meeting with the council and leadership in the City Hall, and we're going to get there. We're going to get it done.
A major restructuring in Hartford has to take place one way or the other. It could be done without a bankruptcy, perhaps. It could be done in a bankruptcy, most certainly. I think increasingly bankruptcy becomes more likely.
Then on Friday, Governor Malloy presented details of a compromise budget, which reflects some revisions to his municipal aid and teacher pension cost-sharing proposals.
It has been 212 days since I presented my first balanced budget to the legislature for their consideration. Since that time, I have presented them with an additional full budget, 2 balanced executive orders, and a mini budget. Today, I present them my third balanced budget. It is my 6th proposal overall. Amongst the biggest changes from my previous proposal are in the area of municipal aid. This budget accommodates increases of more than $850 million. Fiscal year 18 in various municipal aid over the current executive order allocation plan. Let me just stress this. Remember that the executive order allocation plan anticipates that we have no budget. As a result of having a budget, we are able to again demonstrate a different formula for distribution. This also includes a phase-in of a progressive education funding formula, thereby smoothing the transition for communities that will experience a shift in aid. We have asked cities and towns to contribute only the employer share of the educator pension payments for the current employees and phases in those payments over a 2-year period of time. In addition, this budget establishes the Passport to Parks Fund, which would give all Connecticut residents free parking at state parks and beaches and would provide a dedicated revenue source for state parks and waive parking fees for state residents. My proposal includes significant mandate relief for local governments. It addresses the needs of our capital city, restores many of the reductions to private providers, and takes the first steps towards addressing the crumbling foundation problem. The legislature is adamant that they will not adopt an appropriations plan that includes significant cuts to municipal aid. I've been adamant that we must cut spending and that I would not accept a budget that led with taxes. As a result, I am proposing we adjust municipal aid in the ECS formula and the funding for teachers' pensions, but I am willing to accept a modest 0.15 in the sales tax rate and increase the restaurant tax rate as well. Further, I am proposing we scrap my plan to levy a local real property tax on the hospitals. Instead, this proposal offers a multifaceted approach. We will raise the provider reimbursement rates, and we will level the provider tax rate equitably. In doing so, we will also unlock more federal dollars, which we can distribute to the hospitals. If we fail to pass a state budget before September 30th, it will cost us tens of millions of dollars in our current year budget. And we would continue to lose tens of millions of more dollars every month should the General Assembly fail to adopt a budget. The standoff surrounding Connecticut's state budget for fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 19 has gone on long enough. It has inflicted more harm than should be tolerated by any of us in positions of leadership, Democrat or Republican. The time for compromise is now, and the proposal I put forward today represents just that.
Looking ahead, Democratic and Republican leaders in the House and Senate plan to meet again on Monday to determine whether a bipartisan budget agreement is possible. Democratic leaders say they expect budget votes in the House and Senate next week. The House has formally scheduled Thursday for special session. The governor's revised municipal funding plan under his executive order will go into effect on October 1st if there is no state budget in place at that time.
As most people in the room know, we don't have a state budget yet.
The impact of no state budget on higher education came into clear focus on Wednesday at a meeting of the Board of Regents for Higher Education's Finance Committee. In 2011, the 4 state universities outside of Yukon, 12 community colleges, and Charter Oak State College were all consolidated under the Board of Regents. Despite the continued uncertainty about state funding for colleges and universities, the Regents Finance Committee decided to move forward with a proposed budget plan this week.
Not only is it not easy, it's almost undoable since we do not have a budget sitting in place so we know exactly where we are. We're going to be in flux until there is a budget. Potentially, they're talking about voting a budget next week with members of the House and hopefully the Senate, and then, of course, the governor having to sign it. So hopefully that will take place. Of course, it's sooner the better because this affects not only us as a university, certainly cities and towns are struggling to come to some kind of resolve with the dollar amounts, and certainly October 1 is not a good date for cities and towns.
What's changed today? We've gotten an executive order from the governor, which has given us permission to proceed. CBAC has been negotiated, so now we have some idea of what our wages and our fringe benefits are going to look like. And we're already beginning our fall enrollment, so we have an idea of what our enrollment figures will look like. So there's a lot more known today than not known.
It was decided by the Regents Finance team to base the proposed budget on Governor Malloy's executive order spending plan.
Even though in part the governor's executive order is the most optimistic proposal that we've gotten, it's still $8.7 million less than we were working with in fiscal year 17. And for every dollar of general fund appropriation we don't get, we also don't have fringe benefits covered by the state. So that inflates the task to the system. And we're working essentially with about $15 million less under the governor's executive order, which is no easy task, of course. With the volatility in the state funding, we weren't comfortable simply making an assumption without thinking about what happens if we're provided with less funding. And candidly, it's not a very pretty picture, but it is what it is. So we asked the institutions all to put together contingency plans, which at the end aggregated to be about 8.5% of the total state funding. Hopefully we'll never have to draw on these contingency plans, but the message really is that we're going to wind up dipping in reserves if we lose funding.
Well, those are two major concerns that I have. One are the reserves and the other is attrition. And maybe just spend just a moment on the reserves. Where do we end up on these reserves when it's all said and done if we have to go to Plan X?
Should we need to dip into our contingency plans, we're saying that another $20 million is going to come directly out of reserves with no place else to go. That would leave us with $80 million of remaining reserves. I've put together a worst case after that. If we're unable to take the salary actions that we've projected, if we're unable to take the operating expenses that we've said that we could preserve, then we're down to $53 million at the end of fiscal year 18. So I've quoted the National Association of Colleges and Universities Business Officers, or NACUBO, who recommends 3 to 6 months of reserves for a healthy balance sheet, basically, for higher education. We are at just under 1 month at the end of 16. We'll be just over 1 month at the end of 17. But should we have to exercise all of these contingencies, and if they go negative on us, we'll be down to a half a month of reserve.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Not a comfortable rainy day fund.
Before a vote was taken on the proposed budget plan, there were some questions to clarify the newly ratified CBAC agreement.
The way I understand it under the CBAC agreement, if we or another agency, whether it be aging, education, public health, DAS, decides to close down a program, there are no layoffs?
Correct. There's a 4-year job security provision in the CBAC agreement. We are now at the beginning of year 2, because as you remember, the CBAC agreement went back to July 1st of 2016. There's some language in the agreement which allows that in the case of a reorganization, you can have conversations with the collective bargaining units about the impact of that on the employees. And there has to be mutual agreement on how to proceed. But for all intents and purposes, we are proceeding under the assumption that there can be no layoffs of folks covered by collective bargaining agreements for the next 3 years.
The other piece I had a thought on was attrition. How is that going? That's voluntarily,
Correct.
Of course, voluntary, of course. So how is that? Is there any progression there or anything that looks positive as far as folks deciding that maybe they want to wish to retire?
Well, I think we'll know by October 1st what the impact of the CBAC agreement has on retirement system-wide. As you may remember, folks need to retire, I believe, by October 1st in order to maintain the existing retiree health care benefits. And anybody who is a current employee after October 1st then needs to contribute more into their health care and pension. So there's some financial considerations I think people are looking at as they make these decisions. I think once we understand what that impact is, we still are maintaining some form of hiring freeze, because I think we need to be strategic in terms of what positions we are filling, especially as we move forward with our initiatives under Students First. So we'll have a better sense of that after October 1st, but we're proceeding under the assumption that we cannot lay anybody off, number one, and that we are going to have some attrition, and how we refill those positions, I think, is a discussion between myself and the presidents as we move forward.
Marco Jakian also shared a less optimistic viewpoint regarding legislative action on the budget.
And even though I think Chairman Balducci is optimistic about the likelihood of a budget next week, I certainly hope that happens. But we felt that this was a time that, regardless of where the legislature was on adopting a budget, we had to have a clear path forward for our institutions. Should this drag out longer than the next, few weeks, we'll have to see what modifications, for example, to the governor's executive order may come to pass. But we need to be all, I think, on the same page in terms of coming back and revisiting some of these should these assumptions that Erica and the team has put forward are not sustainable.
Certainly cities and towns are in the same kind of a problem, and there has to be pressure. I think there's being pressure brought on the state legislators to do something, because October 1 is a rather critical date, not only for us, but more importantly for the cities and towns. And, you know, there are dollars coming in to pay some of the bills, but they aren't at the rate that they should be. So we're going to face some dramatic changes if things aren't done by the end of this month.
The Board of Regents Finance Committee approved the budget proposal and sent it on to the full board for a final vote.
I'd like to call the meeting to order.
The state budget situation was also a topic at this week's meeting of the State Board of Education. The technical high school system actually had some positive news, considering the lack of a state budget.
We started the year with about 90 vacancies, and we're privileged in that OPM has released 60 of the 90 at this point, so which is, you know, it sounds bad, but it's much better than anybody else in the state's getting right now. You know, Mr. Wibby and the staff are working through the process to get those hires to take place.
We are really grateful to the support from OPM around the technical high school vacancies, because only really, other than those kind of vacancies, only things that are health and safety in hospitals, I think, are what's being approved. But that we're fortunate with the technical high school situation. Also, those are state employees, so our teachers that were already state employees before the CBEC agreement,
July 1.
before July 1, are covered by the no layoff clause as well.
Correct.
So we are very fortunate with that. It gives us a lot of security for the technical high schools to make sure that we can maintain those programs for our kids.
It would be interesting for me to hear kind of where your cut on, the agency's cut on where we are in financing for the local school districts right now, especially as they start the year. It was alluded to, but it would be great to know your perspective.
Obviously, you know, we can only implement what gets passed, and since
Right.
there isn't a budget that's been passed by the legislature, we don't have a budget to implement. So what that means is, you know, with the exception of the technical high schools, for instance, it's a keep the lights on kind of mode, you know, keep things moving to the degree possible. Normally, we would make our first ECS payment to the school districts in October. Third week in October, Kathy, is that right? Yeah. So that's the first time they're due a payment of their state funding from us, because we administer that grant. The revision of the executive order is what will guide how we disperse funding to the districts in October, unless there's an approved budget before then that gives us something different. We sent out the ECS distribution to the districts, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago now, when the revision of the executive order came out. So the districts know what they'll get in October. They know what to plan for. And then they know, from that they can see what, if there's still no budget by January and by April, what they would get as well. Because those are our payout dates for the ECS, which is the large grant.
I'd heard at one point that the state was, they were looking at those districts that were somewhat in jeopardy if they didn't get some monies early on.
Yes.
And making some special arrangements. Did that happen?
In the past, there have been times when school districts have had to approach the department about advancing the ECS. Then we have to go to OPM and see if that's possible. Obviously, any advance would be against what they can expect to be paid, right, not beyond what they could expect to be paid for the year, or for the third of the year, or whatever. You know, if we get a budget, which we certainly hope that we do shortly, then we'll right away inform the board as well as all the districts about what the distributions will be.
The State Department of Education is able to distribute other smaller grants to the school districts in the midst of the budget impasse. Some of them are federally funded. Governor Malloy kept an eye on developments with Hurricane Irma this week as it headed toward Florida. This coming off the disastrous aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in Texas. Speaking from the Emergency Operations Center in New Haven, the governor highlighted the importance of being prepared.
Since I became governor, we've had 6 presidential disaster declarations for blizzards, hurricanes, and tropical storms. We know that a storm can strike at any moment and cause significant damages, as we have witnessed in Texas. Following our experiences with Irene, Sandy, and the snowstorms, we have worked diligently to improve preparedness and communications at all levels of government. And I have to say, here at a municipal facility, we are very proud of the relationship that we have formed with the local communities over these years. We also want to make sure that we in state government are communicating well, and we want to ensure that proper communications extend to all of our residents. Hurricane Harvey and impending Hurricane Irma are also reminders of us to be prepared in case of disaster if it should strike us. The time to plan for a storm is not when it's days away, but well in advance. That is why emergency managers and first responders routinely drill for the worst case scenario. Our residents also must prepare. Now is a good time to make sure that your homeowners and flood insurance is up to date. Make sure that you have basic supplies such as a first aid kit, batteries, canned foods, water, as well as your prescription drugs should you rely on those readily ready and movable, so that if you have to vacate your premises, you take those important things with you.
Governor Malloy is right to call our attention to these potentially deadly threats posed by storms like these. In New Haven, there are about 1,900 acres within a 100-year flood zone. We're working to protect the city from flooding through increased awareness, enforcement of floodplain ordinances, stormwater and drainage system maintenance, and coastal protection. But as literally millions of Texas residents have learned, there's no such thing as being overly prepared.
Residents were also reminded to download the free app, Connecticut Prepares, which includes a feature called I'm Safe, which can keep friends and loved ones up to date on your status in the case of an emergency.
Since its launching, CT Prepares has been downloaded over 10,000 onto 10,000 devices, and we know after the attention that we're giving it today, and with your help, there'll be another 10,000 loading up.
The hurricane season goes through the end of November, but the height of the season is now through mid-October.